Hi Year 7, welcome back to your next lesson with me, Miss Theka. Today we are going to be focusing on James I, who we've been studying for the last couple of lessons now. But today we're going to be thinking about his financial problems, and we are going to be investigating all of the different reasons why James suffered from financial problems, and then we're going to try and reach a judgment as to what extent James can be blamed for his financial problems. Was it his fault that he never had any money, or was it other reasons why he never had any money? So the first thing I want you to do is get the title down for me, please. Can James be blamed for his problems with money? The first thing we're going to do is have a little look at the source, then we're going to explain the different ways James collected money, and then we're going to reach a judgment as to what extent he can be blamed for those problems. Once you've got your title down, I'd like you to write this key word for me, please. Extravagant. Some of you might know what this word means already. If not, if you describe someone as extravagant, that means that they are lacking restraint in spending money or using resources. They exceed what is reasonable or appropriate. So it basically means that they don't really have much control over their money. Even though they might maybe be struggling with money, if they see something that they really want, then they just buy it without really thinking about the consequences or thinking, can I really afford that? Should I really be spending my money on that? Which, to be honest, I think maybe I can be guilty of sometimes if I see a nice pair of shoes or maybe another handbag. We've all been there. But the term extravagant has been used during James's reign by people from his time, and it's also been used by historians after James has died to describe James. They described him as an extravagant person, someone who had no control over their money and just bought whatever they wanted to buy. So write that keyword down for me, please. Extravagant, lacking restraint in spending money or using resources, exceeding what is reasonable or appropriate. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a little Elizabeth quick quiz. So there are 8 questions. They are, I was just about to say they're all multiple choice, but I think that's a lie actually. I think most of them are multiple choice, and I think maybe a couple of them aren't. Some of them are true or false as well, okay? So first one, what does the term armada mean in Spanish? Is it A, it's Spanish for fight? Is it B, Spanish for navy? Or C, Spanish for war? 2. True or false? It was expected that Elizabeth would defeat the Spanish Armada quickly and easily. Is that true or false? 3. Which 2 men were leading the Spanish Armada on behalf of King Philip? So which 2 men were in control of the Spanish Armada? Was it A, the Duke of Alba and Medina Sidonia? Was it B, the Duke of Guise and the Duke of Alba? Or was it C, the Duke of Parma and Medina Sidonia? 4. Why did the Spanish need to dock in the Netherlands? That should have an S on the end of it. There we go. Why did the Spanish need to dock in the Netherlands first before attacking the English? Was it A, because the Netherlands had the best ships? Was it B, because they needed to collect more soldiers and more equipment? Or was it C, because they got lost and they needed directions? 5, this is the one that isn't multiple choice, so I have to see if you can remember this off the top of your head. Which close friend of Elizabeth's came up with the idea of sending in fire ships to trap the Spanish? Which close friend and advisor to Elizabeth came up with the idea of sending in fire ships to trap the Spanish? 6, true or false? The Spanish had cut their anchors to escape the fire ships. True or false? The Spanish had cut their anchors to escape the fire ships. 7, true or false? The Spanish ships were driven north around the coast of Scotland and Ireland. And last one, again, this one isn't multiple choice. What did the Spanish ships encounter as they tried to return to Spain, and what impact did this have on their boats? So there's actually really two answers for that one. What happened to them when they were trying to return back to Spain, and what impact did this have on their boats? So pause me if you've not quite finished, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so number one, you should have had B. Armada is Spanish for navy. 2 is false. It was not expected that Elizabeth would defeat the Armada quickly and easily. Spain was probably the most, if not one of the most powerful countries in Europe at that point, and had the strongest navy. So actually it was thought that Elizabeth would really struggle and would potentially be defeated by King Philip and the Armada. 3, which 2 men led the Armada on behalf of Philip? That was quite a tricky one. That was C, the Duke of Parma and Medina Sidonia. 4, why did the Spanish dock in the Netherlands first? That was B, because they needed to collect soldiers and more equipment. 5, which friend came up with the idea of sending in the fire ships? That was Sir Francis Drake. 6 is true, the Spanish panicked and they cut their anchors to escape the fire ships, which they regretted later. 7 is also true, the ships were then driven up north around the coast of Scotland and Ireland to try and then get back to Spain in that direction. And last one, what did the Spanish ships encounter when they tried to return to Spain? They encountered a really dangerous storm. And what impact did this have on their boats? Their boats were completely destroyed because they had cut their anchors, so they weren't able to secure their boat to the seabed, which meant that their boats couldn't survive within the storm. A lot of them sunk, a lot of men died, and the ships that did manage to return back to Spain were so heavily damaged that a lot of them were sort of beyond repair, really, so it had a massive impact. Okay, so let's get going with today's lesson. So the first thing you're going to do is I'm going to put a contemporary source on the next slide. If something is a contemporary source, that means that it's from the time period. So this was actually written whilst James was alive. That type of source has a different name. Sometimes we call that a primary source. Again, it just means it's from the time. So what I want you to do is I want you to have a good look at this source. I want you to tell me, what can you infer from this source about the reasons why James suffered from financial problems, and who does this source blame for James's financial problems? So first of all, what can you infer? Remember, infer means learn. So what can you learn about the reasons why James suffered from poor finances? And 2, who does this source blame for James's financial problems? Okay, so this is a picture of what the primary source actually looks like, but obviously, as you can see, it's pretty much impossible to read. It's written in slight Old English and also with traditional ink and sort of feathered pen, so it's really difficult to read. So it has been typed up so you can read it a little bit more clearly. So it says at the top here, King James has been accused of financial extravagance by historians. This inventory, an inventory is like a list that someone would write. This inventory provides evidence of lavish spending on a great looking glass that was covered in diamonds and precious stones in January 1604. So James had only been king for a year at this point, and then James writes this list here of all of the precious stones and diamonds that he has bought to put in a piece of furniture, basically. So give this primary source a read here. If you're wondering what some of the little symbols mean, it says at the bottom here, S stands for shilling, LI stands for pound, and D stands for pence. So all of that is talking about the financial cost of it. Okay, so give it a read. And then you are answering these 2 questions here. What can you infer about the reasons why James suffered from financial problems, and who does this source blame for his problems? So pause me now and answer those questions, please, and give this a read. Okay, so hopefully, by reading this, you have been able to infer that this source shows quite clearly that James had very extravagant taste. The looking glass with a clock in it, so basically it's like a decorated table with a clock, he has decided to put all of these precious stones in them, and we're not just talking about 2 or 3. He is literally covered this entire clock in all of the precious stones you could possibly think of. He talks about rubies, emeralds, pearls, diamonds, and then he talks about different shaped ones. So he has some thick diamonds, he then has some triangle diamonds, he then has some great emeralds and some lesser emeralds. He has some that are cut and some that are slightly uncut. So he really does go over the top with his decoration. So for your first question, hopefully you've been able to infer that James had very extravagant taste. In some respects, he was quite over the top. He wasn't just happy with things looking nice, he wanted everything to be as beautiful as possible, because he was a king and he believed that that's the way that kings should be. So they should be grand and majestic, and that nobody else should have anything grander than the king, because he is the king, so everything he has should be the best. And it says at the bottom here that on these diamonds he's spent £2,739, 12 shillings and 6 pence. Obviously that's by their monetary value, so it's not £2,000 in our day, it's £2,000 in their day, so this would have been a considerable amount of money. The second question was, who does this source blame for James's financial problems? And hopefully for that one, you've written that it actually blames himself. Even though James wrote this, it does suggest that the problem was his. He seemed unable to restrict his spending, and it does back up the point that maybe he was extravagant, maybe he didn't have any understanding as to how to control his finances. But we're going to look into that a little bit more. So, during his reign, members of Parliament were highly critical of James's spending. Historians over the years have also criticised his extravagance and blamed him for creating huge problems between the Crown and Parliament over money. However, is it fair to blame James entirely for the financial problems during his reign, or were some of the issues out of his control? And that is what we are going to be thinking about today. So either draw this table out, or I will send this via email and get your teachers to pop it on class chats as well, so you have got like a copy to use on the computer if that's how you've been working. If not, then draw this table out for me, please. So we've got 4 different categories here that you need to record. So first one is extravagance, next one's custom duties, next one's tax, and the final one's royal lands. Then in the next category you want just a small box for definition, where you're going to write what that word means. Then your largest box needs to be this one in the middle here, explanation. This is where you're going to explain the financial problems that came from that factor. And then your final box, this is what your judgment is going to consist of. This is going to be your blame box. Can you blame James for that situation? Is it 100% his mistake, his issue, his problem? Or are there other factors at work that maybe you think, actually, to be honest, James wasn't really in control of that, or that's not really his fault? And then that is where you'd make a little judgment there. James can be blamed for this, or no, James cannot be blamed for this. Instead, A, B or C can be blamed for it. Yeah, so if you're writing this out, pause me now and leave this on your screen for a second so you can copy it out. If not, then have the table up so you can work along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each 4 of these sections with you, because some of them are a little bit confusing. I want to explain some of the language to you, and then once I've finished reading it, you can obviously then start to record your information in your table. So first one, James's extravagance. So we talked at the start of the lesson about extravagance, and I gave you a definition. If you have forgotten it, then here's your definition right at the start here. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. There we go, that's better. Okay, so what is extravagance? Extravagance is a common phrase used to describe unreasonable spending, e.g. buying expensive things that you don't really need. So that would be the first thing you would put in your definition box next to extravagance. So let's have a little look at some of the evidence to suggest that James was extravagant. Obviously you don't need to write all of this down, just pick out 2, 3, or if you can fit in 4 key examples to support James's extravagance. James has always been viewed as an extravagant king who gave no thought to finance. If James wanted something, he got it, regardless of cost. James believed that royalty should have a lifestyle of luxury. Royal finances under Elizabeth had been smaller, but what you do need to remember is that Elizabeth was just one person, whereas James had a wife and 3 children, so royal finances were obviously going to cost more during the reign of James. So you do need to bear that in mind a little bit. It can be quite easy for some people to just think, well, Elizabeth didn't spend that much money on clothes. Well, yeah, of course she wouldn't, because she was only buying her royal wardrobe was only for one person, whereas the royal wardrobe for James was for 5 people, so obviously it's going to be more. But we also need to bear in mind that whilst the cost was more, it was a lot more. So between the years 1603 and 1612, James spent £185,000 on jewels alone. James decided that the royal wardrobe had to be changed. Therefore, the cost of royal clothing increased from £10,000 to £36,000, so that is a considerable increase. James also believed that royal money could be used to treat his friends and boyfriends. So if you remember on your very first lesson about James, you made a little mind map about some of James's problems, and in there we talked about the lavish parties he used to throw, the double suppers, which was a massive waste of money and food, but it wasn't just the parties. James also used to pay off his friends' debt, which you might think that that's quite a nice thing to do. You know, if I would like to think that if I was sort of really struggling, I could ask my friend to help me out. But the problem that James had was he would use his own money to pay off his friend's debt, even though he was in debt himself. So he's actually making his own debt worse. Really, before you help other people with debt, you should be in a secure position yourself, and he wasn't in a secure position. After only 5 years on the throne, the level of royal debt was a staggering £597,000. That's how much debt James was in after only 5 years of being king. Yet in 1610, James had given £90,000 to his Scottish friends in gifts. So if you were in debt by nearly £600,000, you wouldn't give £90,000 to your friends, would you? Because that's not a reasonable thing to do. So you can understand why Parliament would get so frustrated with James, because he wouldn't be told. And if anyone tried to tell him, like, come on James, you shouldn't be giving that money away, he'd get really upset. He didn't like to justify himself, and he didn't think it was Parliament's responsibility to tell him what he could and couldn't spend his money on. So this shows just how little James understood about finances, and it proved that he was willing to do anything to make people happy, even putting himself in debt. So, in your table, you'd put your explanation here, where you're going to explain what extravagance was and why that was a problem for James, and give me some key examples as well, like royal jewels, royal wardrobe, gifting to his friends. And then in the blame section here, you're going to tell me, was James responsible for this, or actually was it the fault of other people? Okay? And if you need to, obviously pause that here so you've got that information on to use. Okay, number 2. Sorry, I've just realised I've made these all a little bit too small. Make them bigger. Number 2, we are looking at custom duties. So, again, I'll put this little bit in red because that's the definition for you. Custom duties. These were also known as tonnage and poundage, which is a little bit of an unusual word, but that's just what they called it back then. Basically, custom duties, or tonnage and poundage, was a tax on goods that was brought in from other countries. For example, alcohol. But it wasn't just alcohol that was taxed. It was a wide variety of things. Tobacco as well, raisins, dates, currants. I'm talking about a really long list of things. We still have custom duties now. If you wanted to import something from a foreign country, you have to pay a charge on it, and things like that. So tax on goods from other countries is still around today and had been around for quite a long time. Tonnage and poundage was a major source of income for James. So whenever someone brought something in from a foreign country, there would be a tax on it, and then James would get a certain percentage of that tax known as tonnage and poundage, and then he was able to use that money however he liked. But this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Because tonnage and poundage was a tax, James could not collect it without permission from Parliament first. One of the main jobs of Parliament is to issue tax, and they declare what the tax is, what it's being used for, and how much tax people have to pay. Then once they've issued that, they can then give the percentage to the Crown, to James. That is one of their main jobs, and James knows that. But James found this really frustrating. He did not understand why he needed permission from Parliament to collect this tax. He thought, in a sense, that it was a bit stupid. You know, I'm the king. These goods are being brought into my country, so if I want to tax them a certain amount of money, then I will tax them. And I don't need permission from Parliament. So in 1604, which again was only 1 year after James had become king, James decided to try and cut out Parliament from the collection of custom duties. He did this by charging merchants and traders on the goods that they brought into the country directly. This meant that the king could collect a regular income, and it effectively became a new unregulated tax, which was illegal. James should not have been doing that, and he knew that he shouldn't have been doing it, but he did it anyway because he wanted the quick cash. This made Parliament nervous. They felt undermined. They were worried that James would spend this extra money on his Scottish friends. Parliament expressed its concerns, but James ignored them. This new tax would come back to haunt James, though. When he called Parliament in 1614, so this is 10 years later, he calls Parliament and he begs them for money. During this time period, James is suffering terribly from huge debt. His eldest son had died in 1612. His closest advisor, Robert Cecil, had died, and his spending goes out of control. It's really, really terrible. So he calls Parliament and he begs them for more money, but they refuse to give him any more money, arguing that he should be able to live off the money he is already getting through custom duties. So a little bit of trouble there. So same again, next one down. Definition of custom duties here. Explanation. What was a custom duty? How was James supposed to collect custom duties, but what did he do to kind of change that, and what impact did that have on Parliament? And then blame here. This is a bit of a tricky one because I think you could kind of argue there's a bit of blame on both sides. James wasn't acting legally, but also Parliament held a grudge, and they weren't willing to help James when he was in financial crisis 10 years later. So maybe the blame can be a little bit of both there. I don't know, it's up to you. You decide. Number 3, again, let me just zoom in on this and make that red. Tax or taxation. So, what is tax? This is a charge of all citizens, and part of the money goes towards funding the crown. So, when I say we, I don't mean you, obviously, because you're too young, but they say there are only two things in this life that are a definite. You will pay tax, and you will die one day. So, you cannot dodge your tax. A tax varies, so depending on how much money you earn in a month, a certain percentage of that gets taken away and it gets given to our government, and then they spend that money on certain things that are meant to improve life for everyone. So the money goes to the council, and then they might improve the roads, or they might improve some schools. It'll go towards the NHS, buses, transport, lots of different things, but a percentage of that money also goes towards the crown, and that is still the case today. Our taxpayers' money does still go towards Buckingham Palace and the Queen and the royal family. However, the problem that James suffered from was that many rich people were dodging their taxes, and this was a serious issue for James, as it meant that he didn't get the correct amount of money from the government. It's a little bit like a wage, money that he's entitled to, that he should get, but all the way throughout his reign he was never getting the correct amount of money because several high-ranking members of Parliament abused the system for years. So what does that actually mean? The more money a person earns, the more tax they have to pay, but people have to declare their own worth. That means, obviously, that it's a little bit different now because we have bank accounts and people can check how much money we earn, and it all goes through a system, and we get like pay slips and wage slips, that kind of thing. But during this time, things weren't recorded as much, so people found it quite easy to lie about how much money they made. So if you said, well, I've hardly made any money this month, then you would only have to pay a really tiny percentage of tax. So many people largely underestimated their wealth, and they did this on purpose to avoid paying taxes. For example, there was a guy called Lionel Cranfield. He worked really closely with James. He'd worked as part of the royal wardrobe, and he'd also worked to actually try and help James's finances. But even though he was trying to help James's finances, he was actually a part of the problem because his wealth was estimated to be around £90,000, yet he only paid £150 in tax, which was far below what he should have been paying. As well as the Duke of Buckingham, which was James's closest friend and also lover. They were boyfriends. James absolutely spoilt the Duke of Buckingham, gave him so much money, land, titles, estates, houses, jewels, all the lot. The Duke of Buckingham was the richest man in the kingdom, second to James, but he hardly paid any tax because he just didn't declare any of the gifts that James gave him. So with one hand, these people are willing to take from the crown, but with the other hand, they aren't willing to give back. So these people are part of the problem. Yet, Parliament was stubborn to address the issues in tax avoidance, and they often blamed James's lack of funds on his extravagance instead of investigating the issues elsewhere. So when Parliament would meet to discuss James's financial problems, they would brush over tax. They'd say, oh yeah, tax isn't really the problem here, let's not really discuss tax. Instead, let's talk about how much money James is giving to his Scottish friends. They were very much willing to criticise James for that, but they weren't actually willing to shine a light on tax problems because then they knew that they would have to pay more tax. So slightly different one there. So in this box, definition, what is tax? Explanation, what problems did James face with tax? And then blame. Can we blame James for the issues with taxation, or actually does the blame fall elsewhere, and why? And then the last one, again, there we are, royal lands. So what is a royal land? royal lands are an area of land that belong to the king, which he can do what he likes with. Most kings and queens rent out royal estates to make money on them. So it's just the same as if we would rent a house now. We'd rent a house and then we give that money to our landlord, the person that actually owns the property. It's essentially the same principle, but the royal family did and does still own massive amounts of areas, huge estates, lots of farming land, lots of parts of the countryside, that sort of thing, and they then rent that land out to rich landowners, who then might turn it into an estate, and then they might rent that land out to other farmers and so on and so forth. It was a good way to have a regular income as a king. So normally royal lands were a good way to make money, but Queen Elizabeth had sold over £800,000 worth of royal lands as a quick and easy way to make money. Once this land was sold, you can't take it back. So you can rent something where you rent a house to somebody and every month they give you a certain amount of money, or you can sell them the house and then you would get one big lump sum of money in one go and then that's it. So depending on what your situation is, if you need a lot of money quickly, then you might want to sell a land or a house and then you would get a big chunk of money straight away. But actually, in terms of a long-term investment, if you rent that house or if you rent that land, then you're going to get a steady income forever, really, as long as there's someone living there. But the problem is Elizabeth needed cash quick, especially when she was at war with Spain. So she sold a lot of the crown lands, and then that meant that when she died, James inherited a much smaller amount of royal lands from Elizabeth than other kings had in the past. So he's already got off to a bad start, and that's not his fault. He can't control that. It was Elizabeth that sold that. However, giving away lands as a reward to hard-working members of the court was a popular way of keeping people on side, and James did that quite a lot. He gave the Duke of Buckingham really large amounts of land, when really he didn't actually do anything. It's just because James really liked him and they were in a relationship. He shouldn't really have done that, because once he's given that land to Buckingham, he then can't give it to anybody else. We can't make money from it. He could have increased the rent on royal lands, but this was really unpopular, and James was always keen to not upset people. Sometimes it seemed to be as though that James would happily put himself in a worse position in order to make other people happy. So he knew that he was in debt, but he would rather be in debt than increase a charge of something and potentially upset people. The use of royal lands became less and less useful throughout James's reign. So, last one. Definition here, what is royal land? Explanation, how did James collect money from royal lands? Why was it problematic? And then blame. Again, this one is a little bit tricky because you could kind of say that some of this situation was beyond James's control, like he had no part in Elizabeth selling royal lands, but also he could have increased rents, but he chose to not do that, and he could have stopped giving land away to his boyfriends, but again, he chose to not do that. So it was a little bit of a mixture on that one. Finally, and then I'm going to go, and if you would like to send me your answer to this question via email, then feel free and I will mark it. So, question. The financial problems James suffered from during his reign were entirely beyond his control. How far do you agree? So I've put this little bit in red here because that's the key part of the question. Entirely beyond his control. If you say that something is entirely beyond your control, it means you play no part in it. It was an accident. It was someone else's fault. There was nothing you could have done to sort it. Can we say that James's financial problems were entirely beyond his control, or do we think that he also played a part in it as well? So if you are wanting to type this up and send it to me, do it in a little paragraph form. So you want to state your case, give me a line of argument. To what extent do you agree? I agree that his financial problems were entirely beyond his control, or I disagree, or you could also do it as a partial. So I think that some elements were beyond his control, but I also think that other parts were his fault, and then try to give me as much specific evidence as you can to support your point. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and I will speak to you again soon.